I know this isn't exactly a hot take because discovery mode for Spotify has been around for some time, but just in case you weren't aware, it allows artists to give up even more of their already tiny payout to make Spotify more likely to recommend them to listeners. Now, there are people on TikTok and other platforms where they're saying this is the best thing since sliced bread for artists, and you can get yourself more listeners by going into discovery mode. Now, firstly, you can only use discovery mode if you've already got a certain number of listeners, more than I have. So I don't want this to sound like it's from a position of being bitter, because I think actually the whole concept, even if I had enough listeners, is fairly destructive. Think of it in two ways. Firstly, you're already getting a tiny payout from Spotify. I mean, to put things into perspective, all streaming platforms pay a pretty small amount, but Spotify pays about half what Apple Music pay, for example, and yet the end users pay the same. So it's already a pretty bad deal for artists. But other than that, if you want to give up even more of your money, then you're in a position to be able to afford to do that. So some artists won't be able to afford to do that. So you're already sort of basically screwing those guys over, right? But I think the more important thing here, other than artists giving up some money to get ahead, is that it ruins the recommendations of Spotify for listeners. Now, people often say to me, oh, I like Spotify because the recommendations are good. And they use that as a reason to use it over things like Apple Music, even though Apple Music is much better for artists. I'm not an Apple shill, by the way. I just think there are platforms that pay artists more, and we need to recognise that. Spotify is not generous to artists, but artists use it because they feel it's the largest one, so they kind of need to be on there. But by being willing to give up some of that income, some artists are just basically skewing the recommendations. So if I'm a listener and I'm a fan of some artist, doesn't matter who it is, and I think I'm going to depend on the algorithm to recommend music for me that's like these guys, then instead of that actually happening to the best of Spotify's abilities, what you're going to get is people who might not be quite as good a match getting recommended over people who'd be a better one, because those guys that Spotify is recommending to you are willing to give up some money. So they're paying Spotify to be put ahead of you. Now, you've always been able to pay money for ads and things, and not just on Spotify, but anything else. And people recognize those as ads, right? You know, you get an ad on Facebook or Spotify or whatever for an artist, and you think, oh, maybe I'll go and listen to them, maybe I won't. But what the difference is here is that it's subverting the recommendation algorithm, which people kind of assume is the best guess that Spotify have to give you stuff you like. But now it's not going to be that at all. It's going to be people who are willing to give Spotify more money. And of course, it will end in some sort of arms race. And you've seen some people on TikTok and other platforms recommending artists use discovery mode because it gets them ahead of other people who don't. But of course, ultimately, where that leads is everyone uses discovery mode. So it doesn't help any of them, and yet they all give more money to Spotify. So I guess what I'm saying here, other than having a general moan, is that I don't think this sort of thing is a good move. And I don't think anyone, even artists who are large enough to qualify for discovery mode, I think maybe think twice about using it, because you are handing over more money to Spotify. You're kind of, I wouldn't say intentionally being harmful to smaller artists, but that's the end result because they're less likely to be recommended. And you're kind of ruining Spotify as a platform. It's not your fault. You've been told this is the way to get more listeners, and I completely understand that. But equally, if we all refuse to do it, then nobody's going to get ahead and we all get more payouts. So I would urge people to think twice before getting into discovery mode on Spotify.